Hello everybody, in this video we'll be thinking about long-run aggregate supply in the classical sense. And in today's lesson we'll be thinking about why is the long-run aggregate supply classical diagram simply a straight line upwards. Now first of all, let's think about what long-run aggregate supply is. Well, in this sense we're thinking about a country's productive capacity in the long run. That means how much is it able to produce given all of our factors of production are fully employed. So it's very, very similar to that PPF you would have learned. In that case, you're thinking about two goods. In this case, we're thinking about the whole economy and all of output. So first of all, let's just draw our classical diagram. So remember, on our axes, we've got price level and real GDP. And simply, the classical long-run aggregate supply is just a straight line. And we denote the point as being YFE, meaning output at full employment. Now, this is very strange because it means that regardless of whether our aggregate demand is low or high, in the long run, the economy is still going to be producing at that YFE. There's going to be no positive or negative output gaps in the long run. Although it's important to know that we can still have output gaps in the short run. Okay, but why is this the case? Well, it's because the LRAS classical version is a classical diagram. That means it's developed by classical economists who believe that the economy, the free market economy, is efficient. And that means that the free market economy, whenever it moves into an output gap or it moves into disequilibrium, it will automatically correct. So let's kind of illustrate this. So we're operating in the short run where aggregate demand intersects with aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is referring to short run aggregate supply here. And they're both operating at that long run equilibrium. That's just going to be our starting point. And now let's say that we move out of this long run equilibrium until we have an output gap. So for example, let's say there's a demand side shock. Maybe consumption has been driven upwards because consumer confidence is quite high. So we're going to get an aggregate demand shift from AD to AD1. So we were at point 1 in the diagram, now we're at point 2. That's our new equilibrium. Okay, so what is going to happen now? So the economy is booming. What's going to happen is that the price level has risen. So you can see that if we mark this as a new equilibrium, the price level has risen to P1 and actual output, actual GDP has grown, although potential has stayed the same. Okay, so we're getting higher inflationary pressure. So what are workers going to do? Workers are going to be dissatisfied with the low wage they get in an inflationary environment. So they're going to basically beg their employers for higher wages. And what are higher wages? They're a production cost. And that means that our short-run aggregate supply is going to shift inwards. And so that's what we must do. We must shift our aggregate supply inwards. And that leaves us at equilibrium point 3. And you can see that at equilibrium point 3, we are back on this long run aggregate supply diagram. So this is a perfect example of how the economy self-corrects itself. Okay, so let's look at an example where instead of aggregate demand shifting outwards, aggregate demand shifts inwards. So let's redraw our long run aggregate supply diagram. Remember, we have price level, which is just the average of all prices in an economy, and our real GDP. And we've got our LRAS curve here. And we're going to assume again that we start in this equilibrium zone, which is the same as the full employment, YFE. Okay. So what's going to happen now is that we're going to have an inward shift of aggregate demand. Why may this be? Well, we might have a period of low investment because of low business confidence. Okay, so we've moved from equilibrium 1 to equilibrium 2 with a new equilibrium. So inflation has fallen and also growth has fallen. And so these firms, they're not going to be very happy. If growth has fallen, that tends to mean that they're making less money. So in a theoretical world, what they're going to do is they're going to lay off staff and they're also going to reduce wages. And if wages are reduced, what's going to happen to aggregate supply? Well, aggregate supply is going to shift outwards. And we can show that on our diagram. AS has moved to AS1, which has marked a new equilibrium at 3. And that moves the price level down to P3. And you can see here that again, we return at that YFE, that full level of employment. And that, in essence, is kind of a graphical proof to show that the classical economists' kind of theory that we always self-correct. And so I hope this concept was, this video was useful and the concept makes sense.